Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Good Governance Academy event. For those of you who are used to the GGA webinars, you know that we have lots of functionality open. We love and promote the chats, the chat function. We have the reactions open today. So please, if you like what's being said, clap, shout hurrah using the emojis. We generally have a lot of discussion on the chat function. So if you want to ask the panelists, the guests today, a question, please do put the question in the Q&A function, because then we will be able to pick it up and ask the questions. I'm just going to share the promo video while we have people coming online, but this is what we're going to be talking about today. That shared terribly well, but welcome everybody. I would now like to hand over to John Gollifer, who's actually the Chief Executive Officer of the BDI, the GCC BDI, and it's our first webinar together, and we are thrilled to be able to host this webinar for the GCC region, but also for other people around the world to get to understand what it is that's happening in the region. But let me hand over to John. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, and a warm welcome to everybody. We're delighted on behalf of GCC Board Directors Institute to be working with Carolyn and the GGA. I always think one of the hallmarks of not-for-profits is collaboration, and the partnership that we've struck with Carolyn and GGA recently is hopefully the beginning of something special. I was interested when we were talking among the esteemed panel of speakers, Dr. Andrea and Dr. Marcus, to note that we're all coming from different places, but hopefully all sort of more or less on the same page when we're thinking about governance in a multipolar world. I'll just say briefly on behalf of GCC BDI, we're like an institute of directors, but we're a regional institute of directors. We differentiated ourselves by calling ourselves GCC BDI, Board Directors Institute. And interestingly, there's a grouping of 26 IODs, Institute of Directors, around the world, of which we are the only one from this part of the world, the Middle East. And as I said, to get together and to have an audience from both GGA and also the GCC BDI, I'm sure from many, many places too, it's a great opportunity to compare and contrast what's going on in the world. You'll all know as governance professionals that whether we call it geopolitics or indeed geoeconomics, we can't escape from it, and it's good to raise our heads above the parapet and have these sorts of discussions. Carolyn kindly mentioned that we're engaging in a partnership, and I'm going to briefly mention what's coming up after today, because we want you to all get involved. We want to get to know you all. So on the 7th of October, we'll also be looking at energy politics and ESG governance. And I note that the legendary Dr. Mervyn King from GGA will be opening that particular session, so one for the diary for sure. And then on the 20th of November, governing through global supply chain disruptions. Again, very important in the environment that we're all working through. So on that note, I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Andrea and Dr. Marcus. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you again to Carolyn and GGA.
Carolyn and John, thank you so much for having us. Delighted to be here with Dr. Marcus and talking about a topic that I think is occupying everybody's mind, especially boards of directors and governance professionals. So I will kick us off with a presentation that I have prepared that is going to give us a big picture, what I like to call the mega trends, or the sort of tectonic changes that are taking place in the world, especially from a geopolitical standpoint. So what I'm going to share with you is a big overview of 5 major mega trends that I think are affecting our day-to-day work, our strategic work, our tactical work. And then I'm going to focus in on the geopolitical tectonic changes that are taking place, which is one of my megatrends. So one of my considerations when I'm looking at megatrends, which I do every year, I look forward for a year and I try to understand what are the big multi-year shifts that are taking place in 5 different categories in terms of stakeholder capitalism, where is it going? In terms of leadership trust, again, a very important consideration. In terms of geopolitical change, in terms of what I call socio-ecological risk, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, and also in terms of the incredible technological changes that are taking place. So one of these is geopolitical. And the question we're addressing here today is how do businesses and boards engage in effective strategic foresight in a world that's beset by deep geopolitical tectonic shifts and or ruptures? I used to talk about shifts, but in the last year or so, last half a year or so, I think we're witnessing something deeper than shifts, something that might be ruptures. So I'll explain that in a minute. When we're talking about shifts or ruptures, I think one of the things that we have to bear in mind for all of us around the world, because we're all interconnected, is that there are many conflicts, unfortunately, taking place. There's probably more going on right now than certainly 5 or 10 years ago in terms of local conflicts, regional conflicts, and international repercussions. And you can see a whole list of some of the conflicts here. But they're primarily in 3 theaters, according to certain think tanks, and I would agree with this. The theater in Europe, Ukraine, Russia, multiple theaters in the Middle East and Gulf area, and then, of course, the China, Taiwan, U.S. Conflict, which is simmering and potentially could go further than that. So that's something we all have to keep in mind as board members and governance professionals. Are we moving towards a multipolar world? This is one of the questions that is posed in the title of today's webinar. And we all know that these issues are percolating, are bubbling. There's a lot bursting into the scene over the last few months with the change of the American administration. And so there are many issues that are beginning to impact all of us as business people and as board members. The tariff wars looms large on all of this. The repercussions on the economy, inflation and pricing, the whole supply chain and sourcing dilemmas, technology disruption factors hugely into all of this. And then there's other reverberations on our customers, on our talent pool, the migration chaos that's taking place in many parts of the world. And then there's real big issues about rule of law uncertainty for all of us, but also for business in particular, depending on where you're doing business, and rule of law uncertainty for individual liberties as well. Are we moving towards a multipolar world? Very possibly. The US has dominated with China over the last few years, and now we have sort of a rearranging of power centers, and certainly the EU and Europe, Russia, because of its nuclear capabilities. And I hate the term Global South because it doesn't do justice to the many countries that are lumped in together there, but there are very prominent countries that are aligning to a certain extent, maybe not others, but they may be part of this multipolar world. On the megatrends, I already mentioned to you that I look at 5 different areas. There's articles on each of those in a series that I wrote recently for Aluminum, a European-based platform. So you can click on this when you get a hold of the PDF and actually look at the details. But I wanted to give you a sense that there's an introductory piece that talks about the 5 megatrends, and then there's a conclusion piece that actually tries to provide some actionable leadership tactics and strategic considerations for each of these megatrends, and I'll share the ones for the geopolitical change in a minute. So why do we need to understand the big picture context? This is really, the big picture context gives us as business people, as board members, situational awareness. This is a term that's used often in the military context, but I think it's really something that applies heavily to the work that we do as business people. There is no country in the world, there's no business in the world that isn't interconnected with other businesses, other organizations, other countries. The footprint of every business, even if you say you have a domestic footprint, a lot of utilities often say that. It's not really true because you have supply chains, you have customers, you have other kinds of interconnections to other parts of the world. And so if things are happening in China and you need certain kinds of minerals to be able to produce your technology or run some of your operations, you are interconnected in a very deep way. So gaining this situational awareness is extremely important as leaders and decision makers in today's world. I also think that's really important to start thinking about sustainable resilience. How do we create a long-term plan, a strategy, and the tactics that go with it that will protect and prepare us for the future, protect our current assets, our current people, our stakeholders. And it's not just about sustainability as a nice thing to do. It's about resilience and sticking around, really having a long-term outlook and ability to stick around as a business, and also adapt to the very, very intense changes that we're seeing. And then, of course, future proofing is something we often talk about in the governance field, but it's all about understanding what your scenarios are. Are you thinking clearly, in a clear-eyed way, about the possibilities? And so having a sense of where your business will go over the next 1 to 5 years, and having the tactics and the strategic foresight to be able to adapt to that is going to give you that sustainable resilience. And of course, the situational awareness is going to give you the ability to factor in the information, the data, what's important for your decision making. So that's why I write about megatrends and I talk about megatrends. So let me give you quickly the 5 megatrends, and then we're going to go back to the most important one for the discussion today, and which is actually my #1 megatrend for this coming year. Geopolitical tectonic shifts rupturing. What I mean by that is we've had a lot of movement taking place in the last 10 years or so that have been quite disruptive. But I think we're getting to a point of rupture now. And I will be very frank, I think a lot of it has to do with the change of administration in the United States. We are changing course dramatically from prior alliances, relationships, ways of doing things. And it's having some very major disruptive and chaotic effects on a large portion of the world. All I need to mention is the decimation of USAID, for example, from a social and international social policy standpoint. It is having very, very direct effects on the well-being and even lives of many people. So some very dramatic things are happening. So geopolitical disruption will continue. Internal domestic political disruption will continue. And by that, I mean some of the democracies, including the US, are experiencing some very dire changes, not for the better. So there are some intense things going on: polarization, politicization, misinformation, factoring into internal domestic political disruption. Then we have exponential technologies, which are turbocharging some of these changes, especially when we're talking about disinformation and misinformation. And it is changing the tenor and the substance in many ways of our internal politics and our geopolitics. And this, at the end of the day, affects all types of organizations. It's not just a business issue. It's not an NGO business. An NGO issue. It's a international issue between countries, and it also affects each and every one of us as global citizens. Let me now move to giving you a snapshot of the other 4 megatrends before I give you a little more on the geopolitical piece. So the second megatrend is what I call leadership, trust, recession, and all of these things are very interconnected. And as governance professionals and board members, this is a really, really important thing to think about and to do something about, because there are many different polls out there, surveys out there, international, national, that are demonstrating a long-term decline in trust, which means that our stakeholders care less or trust us less when it comes to certain kinds of organization. And here you have a compendium of global trust surveys that I looked at, including Edelman Trust Barometer, the OECD Trust in Public Institutions Survey, Gallup Trust in Public Institutions, and a couple of others. And I asked ChatGPT to project it for a 10-year period. And you can see that each and every one of those lines Government is in yellow, media is in red on the very bottom, both of them. Business is darker red in the second from the top. NGOs are pink in the middle, and employers are blue. And employers have been doing well, and business has done relatively well over the years, but everybody's declining in trust in terms of a average of these various surveys. So something to think about that's really, really important for us as again, as board members, as business people. My third megatrend is what I call exponential technology unfettered. And that has also been brewing for several years, but now it's really exploded in terms of just the race that exists. It's a geopolitical race as well, certainly between China and the US, but there are many other important centers of technology development, including in the Gulf countries, of course. And so we have some trends associated with this exponential technology explosion. And I won't go into all the details, but I'm sure you're all dealing with this in your boards. Are you AI ready? Are you AI savvy? Do you understand what's going on in your footprint in your company? And so I just finished writing a book that's coming out next year about this topic of exponential technology. And just to leave you with a flavor of the things that you need to think about as board members looking forward is here are 4 frontiers of exponential technology. Gen AI is clearly part of each and every one of these frontiers, but I like to look at them as in 4 different levels. The biological, like for example, neurotechnology, the mechanical, robotics and automation, the planetary, climate tech and solar and geoengineering and those kinds of things, and the virtual, of course, which includes all of the different kinds of things that we're doing in AI, but also in blockchain and fintech and cybersecurity, et cetera. So again, a mindset that looks not just at the risks, but also at the opportunities. And then my 4th megatrend is about socio-ecological polyrisks and tipping points. That's a mouthful, but it really means we have an interconnected world, climate, biodiversity, and humans. We are all interconnected, and the climate change is affecting the biodiversity degradation that's taking place, and it's having major impacts also on our societies, on voluntary and involuntary migration, on our talent pools when we're thinking about, our own business footprint. So there's a lot going on here, and just as, again, a snapshot, and you have all of these details in the articles that I gave you the links to, but I also looked at the climate tipping points and likely warming thresholds. And these scientists are pretty much in consensus that if there are major events in any one of these areas, Greenland ice sheet, West Antarctic ice sheet, the Amazon dieback, coral reef die-off, that could have major irreversible effects that we haven't even seen yet in terms of the health and condition of the planet. And then finally, megatrend number 5 is what I call stakeholder capitalism metamorphosing. And we're all very aware of the ESG debates and politicization, especially in my own country where I live, the US, but it's also had reverberations elsewhere. And so this sort of politicization of ESG and sustainability issues has had some serious consequences around the world, which is not the topic of today, but I think it also has geopolitical implications, obviously climate and energy policy implications. And so there's a lot going on in this space. And, I asked myself the question, where are we going? We had market capitalism, the golden age of capitalism. We had shareholder capitalism. We looked like we were moving towards more of a stakeholder capitalism and even regenerative capitalism in some cases. And now we're kind of also seeing the alternative, certainly in the US, maybe in some other places, of a more extreme sort of market capitalism, even state capitalism, some people are calling some of the policies in the Trump administration, et cetera. So again, where is this concept going? I don't know, but it's important to know about that as a board member. So let me go back to geopolitical tectonic shifts rupturing and give you a few more details, because I think it all comes back to our geopolitical footprint, our national political footprint and issues. how technologies intersect with that, and how we as businesses have to deal with that. And so here you can see a couple of data points, or important data points, that I think are affecting how we are moving into a more disrupted, more rupturing kind of world. And you see an article here, and it's from March. It's gotten even more accelerated since then, using the term of this roller coaster ride. Trump is overturning the world order that America built. As the president embraces Putin, longtime allies are starting to view the US not just as unreliable, but as a possible threat to their own security. And so we're seeing that play out in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, the relationships within NATO, the relationships between the US and the EU, and other parts of the world as well. And you can see on the right side here, this is a Financial Times survey that was done in the spring, published by the Financial Times, and it shows how the US is more highly regarded than China in most high-income countries, but in the middle-income countries, not so much. And I think this is a trend that will continue unless there are some other major changes that take place that we can't foresee. And I think one of the things that we do need to remember about our times is that the only thing we can predict is unpredictability. The only thing that is certain is uncertainty. And what that means, I think, for all of us is we have to move cautiously and with care and well-informed, but there's also great opportunity in these disruptive times. So as a business person, as a board member, we have to be looking at that flip side of risk, which is opportunity as well. Here, many of you might be familiar with the World Economic Forum Global Risks Report that comes out every year in January. I find it to be extremely useful because it gives you that very big picture overview. And the current global risk landscape, they look at 3 different time periods: the year that we're in, 2 years forward, and then 10 years forward. And I'm sharing only the current and the 2-year because they're the most relevant to this discussion. But you can see, and this was published in January before the Trump administration, and before some of the changes that we've seen geopolitically take place since then. But they had as their number one current global risk a geopolitical, geostrategic risk, which is state-based armed conflict. They had in the 3rd place geoeconomic confrontation. This is very rare that the World Economic Forum lists geopolitical issues at the very top of their current issues. And you can see for the 2-year outlook, they also have them in the top 10. And so I wanted to share that. This is a map from the Economist Intelligence Unit, Democracy in 2024. You may all recall that 2024 was the biggest year in world history in terms of people going to vote. It was 4 billion plus people went to their countries, in their countries went to vote. And this is a look at the spectrum between full democracy in dark blue and authoritarian in dark red. And I would suggest that probably next year we're going to see lighter shades of blue in the Northern Hemisphere, and I don't mean Canada. And so to wrap up, I want to share with you the sort of leadership blueprint issues. These are tactical and strategic things that I suggest at the end of each of my articles. So these are the ones for the geopolitical tectonic shifts. Adopt a geopolitical situational awareness for your executive briefings and board meetings. I think this is really important to include if you haven't already started to do that. Secondly, focus like a laser beam on the intersection of your supply chain and the geoeconomic, geostrategic footprint of your organization, both upstream and downstream, and clients and customers, as well as suppliers. Thirdly, upgrade your supply chain to include a level of Gen AI sophistication that you might need to be able to protect your business. And it's really very important to do this now because there's a lot of products and services out there, but you really need them to turbocharge some of your capabilities. Fourth, name someone on your executive team. If you're a board, ask your executive team about this. To be the geopolitical, political, and policy guru to coordinate some of the important information, risks, operations, countries, levels of involvement, etc., and also be prepared for the crisis that might come. And then finally, integrate geopolitical and political analysis into your enterprise risk management and risk governance, meaning the board. If you're not doing that, I think you are certainly a horse with blinders, if I may say so. You need to open up the blinders and really understand what's going on. So I'm done. I'm over by a minute, I believe. Thank you all so much for listening to my tirade. And I'm happy to send it back to Carolyn and or Marcus.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Andrea. We do have a question for you before we hear from Marcus to put us into the regional context. So here's a comment. We have seen a pushback on global initiatives on ESG and climate change. Any chance of changing focus in the near future? It seems that the powerful countries are no longer interested. What is your sense of what you're seeing from your research?
I would say there's two levels to my answer. One is I mentioned before the only thing that's certain is uncertainty, and so I think if there's a change in the U.S. administration in the next 3 years, let's say, back to the sort of formats that we had before, I could see this coming back certainly from a U.S. policy standpoint, and then of course with allies and counterparts around the world. So I could see that getting back on track. But my second answer is that I think businesses continue to do what they have to do because businesses act rationally most of the time. And so this is why I think business is trusted mostly of all the institutions that we've seen in these trust barometers and other kinds of not that business is perfect, far from it, but business is rational. And so bringing the sustainability and ESG considerations into your business tactics and strategy, especially your longer term view, is actually really good for business. So we are all hearing this term green hushing now. It's certainly in the US and maybe in some other parts of the world, where companies are not talking as vociferously and marketing as vociferously as they used to. On ESG especially, but they're continuing to do the work and they know that it's important for the long term for their energy bills and configurations that transition, but also for their relations with talent, with the society, customers. So I think businesses that are smart are still continuing to do that. And most businesses are smart by definition because they want to make money, right? And so sometimes it means destroying the environment, but most of the time it means finding ways to do it better.
And looking at long term. And talking about business, then let me introduce Marcus to you. And Marcus, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit of insights into the region. And I know that you have done some research on this. Thanks. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, and thank you very much, Andrea, for some great insights from the global perspective. So let me share my screen. I think this is working for everybody now. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know this is a very, very widespread group.
Sorry, we're just seeing the end of your slideshow. Do you want to just go to the beginning again for us?
So there we go. I think we're good.
Brilliant.
Now.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Thanks.
To dive a little bit deeper into the GCC region, in particular, also look at boards and what kind of implications do we see on boards, on board behaviors, on governance in the region. And by the way, for those of you who are not from the GCC, so the GCC, I think as most people are aware, stands for the Gulf Cooperation Council, so basically the Arab Peninsula. It's not the Global Cricket Council, which some people ask me if I'm talking about cricket today, so I have to disappoint all cricket fans in particular around the world. We are talking about boards today. But let me dive a little bit deeper. And as you will see, when we look at my first slide and my first talking points around pressure points for boards in the region, many of these connect very well to what Andrea has showcased as an overview of global megatrends and what's happening all around the world. By the way, just as a bit of background, the majority of the information that you see on the slides is a mix of a lot of research that we obviously do in region and across emerging markets, but also then a fair bit of anecdotal information. I mean, I get to see, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 boards a year. So there's a fair bit of anecdotal input as well that I will provide in addition to some of the research data. On the very left-hand side, I mean, I think this is no surprise to anybody. The AI implications on how businesses shape their strategy. and the AI implications on how boards operate have grown exponentially over the last few years. I really liked the question that just came in about ESG before, because ultimately what was ESG as a topic 5 years ago, every board was talking about how ESG as one of the main priorities, has really shifted quite substantially towards AI. And this is true globally, but also in particular in emerging markets. It's also interesting to see that it changes the composition of boards. So not only what boards are talking about, but also who sits on boards nowadays. Maybe a piece of anecdotal evidence here. As you might know, Heidrick & Struggles is predominantly an executive search firm. We have placed more tech AI experts on boards, in particular in financial services and related industries, over the last 2 years than we did actual bankers. So we see a real shift towards technology savviness, changing composition of boards, and that really has a great impact on what the topics are that we are discussing. The second part here, regulatory and statutory uncertainty, again, linking back to global trends. We have substantial shifts, or Andrea called it even ruptures in geopolitics. We have new governance structures all of a sudden emerging. I mean, who would have thought what's going on in the US when you look 5 years down, I mean, in terms of the stability that the market had versus what it is right now, and what impact this also has on governance. Governance is also very strongly linked nowadays to AI. There's more and more discussion about how do we regulate AI, how do we ensure the ethics around AI as a topic, and how can we bake this into governance elements. There's also constant change of the law. I mean, look at Saudi Arabia, the biggest country in the GCC. New companies law came out a few years ago with very different standards. I mean, the old one was, admittedly 30, 40 years old. But we have seen, for example, multiplications of liability limits. So it has become much more dangerous nowadays to be a board member than it was before. And how do boards react to this? How do board members react to all of these changes is a very, very important question. There still is ESG, so I don't want to say it has disappeared, but it's probably shifted a little bit in focus. I mean, in the GCC, the environmental part is probably stronger than some other markets, simply because of the carbon-driven industry here, oil and gas and everything related to that. And of course, there is social change in the society. When you look at some of the major players like Saudi Arabia or surrounding countries, 10, 15 years ago versus now, we have seen huge societal changes in these markets, at a much more aggressive pace than in most other countries around the world. And of course, this has an impact on customers, this has an impact on stakeholders, and on the business potential for organizations. Board dysfunctionality, there is, of course, a fair bit of that happening. Of course, I say it because it's not only in the Middle East, it's a global phenomenon ultimately. Boards always think of themselves very highly because you have very experienced individuals typically sitting on boards, but not necessarily are they doing a great job when it comes to managing their own dynamics and being really savvy in how they manage boards and board interactions. So making sure that we have good board dynamics in place is another one that we see. And last but not least, and I want to give you 2 or 3 data points on this one as well, diversity and inclusion. I mean, there's ample of research that tells us, scientifically proven, that more diverse boards produce better results. And I'm not only talking about demographics, but let's call it broader diversity of thought that boards can bring. Unfortunately, in the GCC, we are still in a very nascent stage of diversity. We are lowest globally in gender diversity. We are one of the lowest globally in terms of international versus locally based or local board members. We're one of the lowest internationally in industry experts versus non-industry experts sitting on boards, which is also a heavily debated topic. How much is the right percentage for non-industry versus industry experts to have a very effective board? And typically science says not more than 50% at max. So we are definitely lagging behind in the GCC on some of these elements that we see here. What does that mean now in terms of future trends that we see evolving from the challenges that I have shown on the last slide? achieving balanced leadership. So really making sure that we have, as I said, this diversity of thought in the boardroom. And many boards are really taking care of that. So I give you an example, a major consumer goods company that's operating in 25 markets, headquartered in Dubai. Up to about 2 years ago, their board was predominantly male, predominantly 55 plus, and predominantly local population. And then they looked a little bit more into the details of, where did they make my money? Who takes the buying decisions for our products? What is the age group of buyers of our products? And they saw that the majority of buying decisions are actually taken by women. And they saw that the majority of buyers are in the age group 30 plus. So you have a big discrepancy between the representatives of the board and their understanding of the world versus my customer base, what looks like, where's actually my money coming from. So they did a very smart thing. They really reshuffled the board. So making sure that we have good representation, that we have gender balance or even more female population, that we have the right age groups on boards, and so on and so forth. Very important. Boards get also much more into thinking about their own effectiveness in region. So something that we've seen in the US or UK markets or many other markets, Singapore as well, already 10 years ago, starting, or 10, 15 years ago, starting to evaluate themselves, is now really coming into this part of the world as well. So it's kind of a bit of a time lag, but we do see much more scrutiny from shareholders as well on how well is our board actually performing. But oftentimes coming from the boards and the chairs or the NRC chairs themselves and say, hey, how are we doing? How are we comparing and benchmarking against others, which I think is a great trend. I don't want to talk too much about purpose, but purpose, obviously, something in the new generation, Gen Z, that really drives a thriving work environment. So boards becoming more conscious of the soft effects, the softer elements that we see in region is very important. And last but not least, spent already a little bit of time on that on the first slide, building digital and AI expertise. That doesn't necessarily always mean you have to hire real subject matter expert. It's about upskilling existing board members. It's about thinking through what does AI do for our business. Sometimes it's advisors that bring facilitated discussions in, and so on and so forth. I want to take a quick look at also on maturity of boards, and let me not go into all the details here, but we've categorized boards. This is a classification I use a lot with clients into 3 different buckets. We see a developed board, an advanced board, and then the true world class. And by the way, there are many boards that are not even on this slide. So if you have a strongly dysfunctional board, a board that does not obey governance and so on, it would be to the far left-hand side here. So the developed board starts kind of as a foundational element where you'd say, look, it's working well. We're meeting the basic governance requirements. We have some CEO succession planning in place. The board skills are largely what they should be. And we are looking at control as well as company interest in a reasonably balanced way. So we are okay as a board, but we are not necessarily high performing. So the advanced board is really looking at high performance of the board, but more so high performance of the organization. Now, what can we do as a board to measure lead and lag indicators? How do we really drive performance of our C-suite team and proactively address skills gaps? How do we have the right committees in place? So it goes also much deeper into governance. And last but not least, adding this, what we call a strategic asset to this would then make a world-class board. So can the board really help to propel the business forward? And that's where subject matter expertise comes in. That's where relationships comes in. Can the board help to open new channels of products, of relationships in the market? Is there positive cultural reinforcement? So does the board also cascade values and cultures down? Very, very key. Now, I often get the question, percentage-wise, where do boards sit in the region? I would say a fair percentage, and I'm not talking about single digits, but a fair percentage is in 20 or 30% would not sit on this slide. They are pretty much dysfunctional. They haven't even the basics of governance in place as they stand today. The majority is probably in the forward-looking developed board space, and then a smaller percentage in the advanced board space, and very few in the world class. I would say it's a small single-digit percentage where I could wholeheartedly say, well, we've seen cases or I've observed or organizations that do really well. And it's typically the organizations that have gone diverse, that have really made sure that we have international diversity, we have gender diversity, we have diversity of thought in general, that are playing a much better role in this. Some interesting thoughts here around what are boards spending their time on and what becomes more increasingly important for boards. And when we look at the light bars, these are GCC respondents versus global respondents. So we run this as a global survey every year, about 30 different questions. And this is one of them in terms of what do boards spend more time on. And I think there's very little surprise about emerging technology, risk, geopolitical volatility, sustainability. It's exactly the same what Andrea said in her presentation about the megatrends. So we see a clear linkage and a clear alignment between boards, board topics, what they are working on. It is interesting, however, to see that in all these topics, the light blue bars are longer than the dark blue bars, which means there is a bit of catch up to do on the one hand, but I think it also means that there are specific drivers in this region, and geopolitical volatility is clearly one of them. One of the biggest deltas that you can see here, this region is impacted a lot by geopolitical volatility. Of course, we have conflicts all around us. If you fly 2 hours from Dubai, you are basically in 3-4 different war zones, as sad as it is. So there is a lot of this going on, and of course, this has an impact on what boards talk about. Interestingly, when I reverse it, and I look what spending global organizations more time on, culture, cyber risk is much higher than what it is in this part of the world. So you see different drivers, and I think different levels of maturity that show us what the boards really focus on. And one more piece of data. In general, so there are two statements I want to make about this slide. This shows us operational involvement of board members. So how much do board members get involved in day-to-day business issues? Rather than having only oversight, how much do they really get their hands dirty? And that's always a good and a bad thing. You want to strike the right balance between the operational oversight or the operational support that you provide and the fiduciary duties, the governance oversight that you provide. So what's quite striking is that these percentages are pretty high. So the operational involvement of boards into day-to-day business is increasing. And we have seen this trend for the last 2-3 years consistently across the board. So most boards, you can see 60-70% of board members say, I'm involved more in operational matters now than I was years ago. So it is increasing. And it's also even more interesting to see that in the GCC, this is by far the highest value globally. So we see directors, independent directors, non-executive directors really getting more and more involved. And I don't think that's necessarily a good thing, but because of all these tectonic shifts that we have seen, or call this uncertainties because of the disruption through AI and geopolitics, they feel compelled or almost like forced to get involved and provide more support to management. As I said, this is a good thing or a bad thing. It depends very much on a case-by-case basis, but I think it's a really interesting element to see how boards perceive their role differently than they would have done 5 years ago with potentially calmer waters around them. And last but not least, 2 cases that point towards what I said about AI and evolution of AI for organizations. One is IHC. It's one of the major diversified investment conglomerates in Abu Dhabi, but a $200 billion organization. So very much in remit locally as well as globally. We've done some work for them as well over the last few years. And they are looking at it very much from an AI perspective, what their business, what to invest in the future. So what can we do ultimately in order to become more effective as an organization, but also what are organizations that we want to invest in. And they were the first one in the GCC that have now implemented an AI board member, so to say. It's called Aid and Insight. So it's not a physical, or it's not a robot that sits in the room. It runs on a laptop, but it is part of the board meetings. So basically everything that they want information on, or everything that is said in the board, will be run through the AI engine, so that they get additional support, real-time additional support on decision making. So it's basically an AI advisor that is real-time live participating in board meetings. This is I think was implemented about 6 months ago, and it's we haven't seen much of this globally. So they're quite forward looking in this regard, and have taken it really to the next step. And let's not forget, I mean, AI and the LLMs are still in a very nascent stage. So this will, I think, become a very powerful model in the future. And last but not least, on PAF, an organization that's probably familiar, many of you will be familiar with, the Line, NEOM, the Asian Winter Games in Saudi Arabia, and so on. You know, all these mega projects that are in the region, they are all under the umbrella of the PAF. It's about a $1 trillion investment vehicle in Saudi Arabia. They have really gone down the route of governance cascade. So what is our they ask themselves, okay, what is our strategic remit? And how can we make sure that our strategic remit is cascaded through all the boards of all the assets and all the investments that we make? And the AI plays a major role. You know, if you look at some of the investments they made, when Mr. Trump, he was already mentioned here, when he was in Saudi Arabia, he did not only get promises for $600 billion of investments. He also promised, I think, 200,000 of the newest NVIDIA AI chips to the Saudi government, which are in the process of being delivered. So we see basically everything around AI has been a structurally important component for them, and they have really baked it into governance as well in terms of where they make investments and what they do. Let me pause here. Sorry, I think I overran by 1 minute, but this was what I wanted to say about the Middle East.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for that. Really incredibly insightful. There are so many questions now. The Q&A function is blowing up. Let me just allow everybody to see everybody on the panel. So let me ask the first question here. Where is it? Q&A. Ahmed was the first one to post. We are traders, I'm guessing the GCC region, where imports from Asia is pivotal. Do we see more disturbances in the near future, from what Andrea is saying, and take account of it in risk planning? And do you see that boards are doing that? Is actually, you mentioned it, but is it what you see?
Yeah. I mean, the GCC overall has tried to play a kind of a neutral role in this entire global geopolitics. On the one hand, yes, they're very close to the US and some of the European countries. On the other hand, they have remained very close business partner with China, with India, where a lot of the oil exports are going to. So striking this political balance has always been challenging, but so far I would say that the region has done it quite well. And we see the same true for boards. They do not want to be seen as partial to the West or the East in terms of how they do business and where they import, export, produce, and so on. So it is definitely a topic in most boards, and we see that risks are perceived more strongly now with the US becoming a more unreliable partner.
Thank you. And here, maybe just to switch over to you, Andrea. What are your criteria? This is from Rick. What are your criteria to determine how rationally corporations act in response and anticipation to the mentioned game-changing megatrends? What is it that you're seeing globally?
Yeah, I think. Oh,
sorry, it's Andrea.
Yeah. For me, the criteria that are most important, and really goes to a lot of what Marcus just shared with us, is having these more advanced boards that really think strategically, have the right people internally at the board level. And by right people, I mean the diverse mix that Marcus alluded to, and I saw also in some chat comments. Diversity of thought, experience, geography. And I think the example that Marcus just gave about changing the composition of your board to reflect more of your customer base or your a geographical footprint, these things are really, really important. So if you don't have those people, not only in your board, but also in your executive team, depending again on the footprint, the products, the services, etc., the technological piece is also super, super important. So if you don't have those people around the table at the board and at the executive suite, you're not equipped to deal with this world. And even beyond that, I think most typical board members haven't been thinking about geopolitical situational awareness, haven't been thinking about the impacts that things will have on you if they happen in the South China Sea. If your supply chain is going to China or to Taiwan and something happens in that part of the world that's disruptive. I mean, people do talk about if there's an invasion or a disruption of Taiwan, the whole chip industry goes to, to hell, excuse my expression. And there are some huge reverberations that will come from that. So I think one of your scenario planning that you need to think about, and that's another topic that I think is super important to boards and executives. Scenario planning has to take into account these extreme disruptions as well as medium kinds of disruptions. So have the right people, do scenario planning, develop the situational awareness, and also have a really good enterprise risk management program in your company.
This is it gets on to, there are a couple of questions around this that I'll put to Marcus. It's really, as you say, sorry, first thing I need to do, this is our first webinar with the GCC BDI, and I'd really like to understand how people got to know about this webinar, especially since we want to promote the next two. There's so much happening in the GCC region that I think it's really important for us to discuss that region. So I'm going to launch a poll now, if people wouldn't mind completing that. But back to the question. And I've even received WhatsApps about this, Marcus, so people online. So Zainab and Lutfi, who also asked the question earlier on, I'm just going to ask Zainab, on the point of boards being more operationally involved, is there a more measured way to manage risk, i.e. staying compliant, maintaining governance, but protecting the board's ability to focus on more strategic aspects? And then Lutfi's one, having board members heavily involved in operations and day-to-day is creating conflicts and with the CEO and executive management. So if you can just unpack that operational involvement just a little bit more, thank you.
Yeah, look, the operational involvement that we see, it is quite situational. I couldn't say give the normative answer as if this is good or bad, because you have some boards that play a very, very crucial role in supporting management on some of these decisions and do it in a very balanced way, while giving a lot of guidance but not overreaching. And then there are others who might think they have a lot of knowledge, but maybe do less so, and then conflicts with the CEO arise. But yes, in general, to the question of Lutfi, it creates more points, more challenging points between and relationships between the CEO and the board in general. And the question about risk management or oversight here is a very valid one, because I mean the board has predominantly fiduciary duties. Yes, it needs to guide management and validate the strategy and the purpose, the mission of the organization, but then also it needs to scrutinize what management is doing. And if they get too much involved, it is not always to the greater benefit of the business. We get, I would say, 10x the requests at the moment, for example, to manage chair and CEO relationships, do some coaching, some interventions there than we did 10 years ago. So you can see the boards were much more hands-off in the past than they're what they're right now. And just, sorry, a bit of a long-winded answer, but just one more thought also from a compliance perspective. Some of this is driven by the regulators. While the regulators are not saying, look, you need to get more operationally involved, because they have tightened up the rules so much, because there are much higher liabilities for board members feel forced to get involved much more. So I've recently been part of a search for a board member for a major bank in the region. And many candidates, very, very qualified candidates, declined because they said, look, all these boards talk about now is governance and reducing their own liabilities. I really don't have time anymore to contribute to business. So what's the point? So it's the regulatory dynamic as well, which again is driven by geopolitical changes. So it's almost a circle here.
It's interesting, and I myself find myself my sweet spot is as an independent committee member, so being appointed to a board committee. And although there is still the responsibility there and the accountability, I find that it's it's far more hands-on, being able to engage management to translate to the board. So I certainly find that role, and it seems to be an up-and-coming role that most boards are looking to bring this diversity in at a committee level, bring that thinking into a committee level. So that's something. But also another question for you from Colleen here. How do we as board members, so now taking at the higher level, ensure that we focus on our strategic remit and less on the operational issues? And could it be that the board needs capacity building to, so what is the solution to that problem that you're seeing?
Yeah. Twofold. One was mentioning capacity building, or capacity hiring. So I think first is, do we have the right people on the board? I'm always terrified when I work with boards where you have 100% industry experts. A lot of board prides themselves, oh, we're all industry experts. Horrible. So the worst boards to work with, because they are just looking down from an operational lens on us in kind of a groupthink way. So having the right diversity of skill sets is very beneficial, because if you have not only subject matter experts, you will naturally stay on a much higher elevated level on the board. And the second thing I say is, a lot of it depends on the chair. If you have a good chairman that proposes, that really propels the right remit, that manages the discussion in a way that they stay on a certain level, that manages the agenda, which is also the chairman's remit, to guide and manage the agenda. The corporate secretary executes, but the chairman provides it. That's the essential role of the chair, to make sure we are talking about the right topics at the right level.
And we have got a series of Taking the Helm with Professor Mervyn King. So if people have a look at our events, that's really about the critical and pivotal role of the chair. But also what you're mentioning is moving forward, the role of the nominations committee and the appointment of the right individuals to these boards is also critical. We don't want the people just leaving the boards. Andrea, would you like to add to that?
No, I would love to discussion. And being very deeply immersed with governance in the Western Hemisphere mostly, the tendency in North America, especially in the US, is to do all this hands-off stuff. So we're on that left side of that spectrum of not being operationally involved. And I think that's a mistake too. Being too operationally involved is a problem, but being too, there's an expression, I don't know if you use it in other parts of the world, but it's noses in, fingers out. And I don't like that expression, because I think it's kind of gross sounding, but I don't like it because it says basically board members can sit on their boards, not serve on their boards. I really feel very strongly about its service, and it has to be proactive service. Not getting into the nitty-gritty of the operations, but really understanding what's going on in the operations. And that means having the right people in the executive suite and being very demanding of the CEO that they have the right structures in place for enterprise risk management, for compliance and regulatory, for really for whatever is most important for that particular business. And having it work, not just in place, but actually, that they walk the talk. It's not just about having the structure. And so I think that we're entering an era where that situational awareness piece is so important, but also we need to do proactive strategic oversight. We need to, not get in the operations, but be very requiring and demanding of what's going on inside the structures, and bringing some of the people up to the board to talk to us that we don't typically bring to the board to talk to us. Maybe they come once a year, maybe have them come a little more often, whether it's the chief risk officer, regulatory, legal, some of these complex areas that need proactive oversight.
Yeah, and external people.
Yes,
bring them in as well,
yeah.
especially on these geopolitical risks, this multipolar world that we're speaking about. I know we've only got time for last comments, but I do have a question on the survey that I know we're not going to get to outside of this. Where is it again? Where was it? Yes, okay, from Lutfi as well, and Heloise has commented on that. Based on your survey, Marcus, what is the percentage of companies in the GCC that have a formal and well-structured board evaluation, and how often? So what is a common practice, I would say? And who is responsible for the evaluation? Is it generally internal or external people?
Yeah. So the percentage of boards that do it really well is very small. I would say single digits at this point in time. Yeah, there is a mandatory requirement for stock listed organizations in most markets that every 3 years you have to do an external evaluation. But unfortunately, the governance rules do not prescribe how it's to be done. So this could be a 5-question questionnaire that's sent out, and that's it. But in terms of something where you have quantitative data, qualitative interviews, board observations, benchmarking with other organizations, so a real proper board evaluation, it's very, very limited. Usually the organizations that do it, who drives it, it is the chairman of the NRC who is usually the main point of contact and responsible for making it happen in collaboration with the chair of the organization. And then the corporate secretary is typically the one that executes the operational parts. In certain cases, the shareholders say, look, we want to do a board evaluation, and they are the ones also looking at it from an external perspective. Some organizations do it internally. How much is a self-evaluation worth that you do internally with your own members, including the ones that actually sit in the board? Yeah, judgment call is required here. But yeah, it's still very nascent.
Okay, last 1 minute left. Last comment, Andrea.
I couldn't agree more with Marcus. I think he's given an amazing perspective from a GCC region area governance. I think there are variations on the theme, but I think all of us as board members anywhere in the world really need to step up our game, not only for the geopolitical piece, but for the technological piece and the climate piece, which some of us are putting on the side, but I don't think that that's possible from a trends, mega trends, and you know, the future of the world. So I think board members have to think about technology, geopolitics, and sustainability in a really stepped up way going forward.
Brilliant. Thanks, Marcus.
Well, I think great question. Thanks everybody for participating. And maybe one piece of thought is, as oftentimes people from other markets kind of belittle the capabilities of the Middle East or some of the other emerging markets. You might actually be surprised about the level of sophistication that many boards and board members have here. And I think, you know, making sure that everybody scrutinizes their own thoughts when doing business with these organizations is something you should definitely consider.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you so much, John, for partnering with us on this webinar, and this is a really, really important topic. The summaries will be provided on the event page, so please use the event page as a source of ongoing knowledge with the recordings. And with that, I'd like to say thanks everyone for joining us, all of the attendees, and looking forward to the next webinar with the BDI GCC BDI. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, everybody.
Bye then. Bye.